people talk about classroom management, and I say, go see the best teacher in your building, whatever they teach. Just go watch them, and you'll see they never deal with discipline. It's not about classroom management. It's about content. The best teacher in the building, the kids are walking in the door saying, man, I can't wait for this, right? So our job is to give kids irresistible musical opportunities. When it's irresistible, kids aren't thinking about acting out. They want to be there.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Everything Band, a podcast that features conversations with composers, conductors, and performers of music for winds and percussion. My name is Mark Connor. I'm a composer and educator, and each week I have the good fortune to speak with and share the stories and wisdom of musicians and leaders in the band community. The Everything Band podcast is a proud member of the Music Teachers Development Podcast Network. The Muted Network provides support in the form of audio-on-demand programming designed by and for music educators. You can find more information about our network at mutedpodcasts.com. Before we begin, I'd like to thank all of you for listening. I appreciate your time and hope that you are finding value from these interviews. I rely on word of mouth and social media to bring the show to new listeners. If you think you knew one or two people who might find these interviews useful, please let them know about it. You can also help by following me and sharing posts on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube. Remember, help your students live up to the best that is in them through music. Now on to my next guest, Ramona Wis. Hi, Brian. How are you?
I'm fine, Mark. Thanks.
So, Brian, can you take a moment and introduce yourself for the listeners?
Sure. My name is Ramona Wis. I teach at St. Charles North High School. This is year 15 there. For me, I teach bands right now, 3 concert band assignments. I also teach a jazz band. I have taught orchestra and even vocal jazz at St. Charles North over the years. Prior to that, I was at Roosevelt University for 6 years as a member of the music ed faculty and an administrator. And prior to that, Naperville North High School. And I also taught in the elementary schools in Naperville. And prior to that, my first job was at Fenwick High School in Oak Park and Nazareth Academy in LaGrange Park.
So, Brian, can you tell everyone how you got your start, your musical origin? What instrument do you play, and when did that all begin?
Sure. Well, my major instrument was trumpet all the way through schooling, but I actually started on the bugle when I was in the Cavalier Cadets Drum and Bugle Corps when I was in the 4th grade. So I actually started drum corps before I started to learn a traditional band instrument. Went on from there after a year of the Cavalier Cadets to start in a school band in Glendale Heights. Actually, I went to Marquardt Middle School with Dennis Osterman and Richard Hammond, and went on from there to Glenbard North for my high schooling, and played trumpet throughout.
And your family is heavily invested in the drum corps you mentioned.
Yes. The Cavaliers were started in the 40s by Don Warren, who we just lost recently, unfortunately. But after many decades of service to the drum corps activity, drum corps were, of course, outgrowths of Boy Scout troops back in those days. And Don started a drum corps from a Boy Scout troop, and got VFW sponsorship. And so my father and his 2 brothers were members of the Cavaliers at that time. And that's kind of how I ended up getting involved, because as those members of the Cavaliers were growing up and starting their own families, they wanted something for their younger kids to be involved with. And so the Cadet Corps was formed, I believe, in the early 70s. And my father was recruited to help teach that, himself being a band director at the time. And that's when I ended up getting my first experiences in the musical activity, playing an instrument. I actually learned that first through the corps. And something else I should mention is, now we're all very familiar with or accustomed to drum corps being filled with not only staff members who are degree holding musicians, but also so many of the marching members are music majors. Back in that time, nobody was really in their school bands. In fact, when I started, I marched with the Cavalier Cadets for 3 summers. So I was 10, 11, and 12 years old. And when I started the school band in 5th grade, I was one of the only marching members at that time to be in a school band. Most of them just did the corps. And of course, over the years, that kind of changed over to where it was almost looked down upon, frankly, by drum corps members that, oh, you were in your school band, to, of course, really being kind of a prerequisite. And now, of course, they expect, a healthy supply of music majors in college being a part of the drum corps activity. So it really has changed quite drastically, going from very local activity where everybody was right around the neighborhood to now, now most of the members are coming from out of state for these kind of top 10, top 12 corps. So it really has changed quite a lot.
So Brian, I have never been involved in DCI. I was how do I want to say this nicely? I was a indifferent college marching band member during my music major years. So can you tell me more about how that activity in drum corps being such a part of your family, how that influenced you going on to college, and then even as a band director now? What have you picked up from that, and what do you gain from that?
Well, the main thing, it gave me a comfort zone with such an important aspect of high school band teaching, that being marching band. So I did not march with the Cavaliers, what we called the A Corps, or the older students. My senior year of high school, I was invited by Len King, who taught for many years at Rolling Meadows High School, but he ran a summer endeavor called Jazz Abroad, and had the opportunity to go to Europe playing lead trumpet in that band. And so that would have been the time that I would have started with the Cavaliers, but instead did that. And then, of course, college started. So I never did really find the time to be a part of the older activity. But in watching my brother go through it and just being a fan over all these years, it's clearly, it gave me, again, just a real comfort level with teaching high school marching band, having been involved as a little kid, and then just being around the activity so much and an enthusiast. So in Naperville, we did have a competitive marching band there, and again, I felt very comfortable putting shows together. We also competed in my very first job at Fenwick and Nazareth. So I didn't have sort of that anxiety that I think a lot of young teachers had about the activity, because it was always just very comfortable for me.
Obviously, you knew from a pretty early age then that you were going to be a band director, that you wanted to go into music education.
Yeah, I made that decision somewhere around my sophomore year of high school. And my father's reaction when I told him I wanted to do that, he said, well, you're not going to do that. You're going to do something else, like be a lawyer or a doctor. So I've found over the years, I don't think that's an uncommon reaction when you have a parent who's in that same career field. They're kind of hoping for something different for you. But I also think he was making sure that I wasn't just choosing it because it was something, that everyone in the family had done, and that I didn't feel obligated to do it. And so as I made the case to him, he has been my biggest fan all these years. Once he was convinced that it really was something I wanted to do. In fact, we just give a veterans concert every year at my school, and my parents are always there. They're there every year, so they've continued to be big supporters of the career decision. But the initial discussion was, he really wanted to question me on that. Like, are you absolutely sure this is what you want to do? Takes a lot of time, doesn't pay as well as some other careers. Are you sure? And I appreciate that, looking back on it, that he really made me prove to him that, yes, this is what I want to do for me, not just because you did it or your brothers, but that's something I wanted to pursue.
So Brian, where did you end up going to school? I
went to Northern Illinois. I had auditioned at University of Illinois and Northern Illinois. And, from a concert band, from a preparation standpoint for being a band director, U of I, of course, had a very strong reputation and continues to. But they did offer me a small scholarship to go there too. But when I auditioned at Northern, who did not offer me scholarship to go there, I was excited to go there because they really, in my opinion, paid more attention to the jazz side of the equation, and that was something that, having come through the all-state experience, I was lead trumpet player in the all-state band my senior year, and I really had a desire to continue to pursue that. And U of I had at that time, they certainly had a jazz band, but it wasn't quite as developed, in my opinion. And if you look at it now, I think it's an incredible program today at U of I. But at that time, it wasn't quite as big a deal as the concert program and the marching program. So I decided to go to NIU. And I'm really glad I made that decision, because I really felt that I really ended up having a well-rounded experience. I did do marching band there all 4 years. I was drum major marching band there, and actually was on the staff in the last part of my tenure there, and was able to play split lead in the jazz ensemble there with Rob Parton, which was a fantastic experience. Rob is now teaching at North Texas. He was a grad student in the year that I was in the band, so I learned so much from him, and of course had a fantastic wind ensemble experience with Stephen Squires, who was not only the conductor of the wind ensemble, was also my trumpet teacher for 2 years. Phenomenal musician. So all of those experiences, when we look at what it takes to really be a successful high school band director, those three areas are so critical. And so I'm really glad that I went to NIU. Did my master's work at VanderCook over 3 summers. At that time, that was before Charlie got there. So Fred Lewis was there at that time, working with band. I learned a lot of repertoire from Fred. Very thankful for that time. Had an independent study with him where we reviewed a lot of repertoire. So I ended up then going to do my doctoral coursework. I'm ABD, which of course means all but dissertation. So I'm in that rather large group of people who did coursework but didn't quite get through the dissertation phase. But I did that at University of Illinois, and so that's the total of my educational background.
You mentioned when you were talking about your what you're currently doing that you did some teaching at Roosevelt University?
Right. So when I took a leave of absence from Naperville North to do my doctoral coursework, so I was gone from January through August to do my residency at U of I, and during that time, a position at Roosevelt came open for music ed faculty there, and so I went to Roosevelt, and during that time transitioned into administration, took an interest in, had thoughts at that time possibly becoming a dean of a college of music. And so an opportunity opened to be dean of enrollment. So I oversaw the budget, scholarship budget, the audition process, recruitment. And so I was there for a total of 6 years. And while I was there, I continued to teach the philosophy of music education course throughout. But during that time earlier on, I taught the wind ensemble conducting classes, methods classes. So that was a very, again, a very important time. It was especially insightful to be able to see how an entire organization works. And I think when I went then to St. Charles North, I became the lead teacher there. And so that was, which would be a department chair in some situations, but this was a non-administrative role, but it was nonetheless, the leader for the music department, and having that background in being an administrator in college really helped me to, I think, have a full appreciation for the importance of all areas of the music department really being strong, instead of kind of having a silo approach, which can oftentimes happen to high school band directors, where they're just so busy, and that's understandable, but they take a very narrow approach that they just think about the band. And so I'm really proud of our department at St. Charles, because we really value all aspects of the music program. We support each other. We do a lot of collaborative work. And I think that's a direct result of the experiences that I had at Roosevelt.
So, Brian, I want to talk about this idea of sort of seeing the big picture in your program that you learned from Roosevelt and that you're applying now in St. Charles. What does that look like for some of my listeners? How can they apply that to their programs?
Well, I guess that's going to come from a shared philosophy. And so, of course, it would be easy if all the teachers in the department are on board. That may not be the case. So if you have a belief that that's the way to go, then the first step is really establishing those relationships with your other colleagues and having more, finding time for discussion to talk about these sorts of things. And, there was one event when I got there that was done as a full department. It's still happening. It happens in December. It's called the Constellation Concert. And other schools do this sort of thing, have been doing that sort of thing before St. Charles started it. I think particularly the District 204 in Naperville would do around this time as kind of a holiday concert where all the major groups would perform just one piece. And so that was their shared experience, was that event. But it wasn't so much, it was really more for the holidays and to have a really big audience. They treated it as a fundraiser. But it wasn't necessarily because they saw the value in doing things collaboratively. And so one of the first things I suggested was in the spring that we rent a concert hall and we take the capstone groups from choir, band, and orchestra and present a concert together. And of course, for the orchestra piece, we could use the winds and percussion from the wind ensemble. Over the years, we've also done some pieces combined with choir and band or with orchestra and choir. And that has proven to be just such a special event that everyone looks forward to now. But in the initial years, it took a little convincing of my colleagues to be willing to try it, because of course they're used to doing their, end of the year choral concert or orchestra concert on their own, and that too has value. It's a special time. So in some ways, the initial reaction was kind of like, this is one more thing, and we know we're all busy. But as we started to do these collaborative concerts, we had choir parents saying, wow, I didn't realize the orchestra is wonderful, or the orchestra parents saying, wow, the choirs are fantastic. I had no idea, because we spend so much of our time apart. And so that, and I would say the other main thing that really helped us to galvanize as a department is that our boosters are music boosters, we don't have separate booster groups. And in many schools, of course, you have band boosters, and that's all, as far as booster groups. But if there are others for choral or for orchestra, they tend to be separate. And I think that's potentially a mistake, because there's so much power in having all of the parents supporting all of the kids. And we know that, particularly in marching band, that there's a lot more financial need in band. And so I think that has, it's been necessary to have band boosters, of course, all these years. But I think it's important to consider at least joining forces. And so we've had years where the music booster president is a parent of a choral student, and they are helping to raise money for something the band needs, or buying a new cello or bass for the orchestra. So they really have a much more global outlook, I think, and see the music department as a true department, not just separate areas that happen to inhabit the same part of the building. So those are two things that we've really made a priority at St. Charles, and I think it's really been to the benefit of the whole department.
So you mentioned that there's a marching band boosters. Is that separate from the music boosters?
Not at our school. I was just indicating that at many schools that is the situation, because their financial needs are so much higher, particularly if they compete. And I understand that, and I understand the reluctance, therefore, of a lot of band directors to say, well, we don't want to open this up department-wide because, A, we need so much more money that the other parents are going to be upset that they're giving so much money to the marching band. And B, they don't necessarily want fewer dollars going to their side of things. They don't want that risk. But I think there are ways to talk through that. And one of those is to say, well, let's treat marching band, as it's an activity that has its own financial needs. Maybe set that aside and let's focus with our music boosters, on concert band, orchestra, choir. So that, there are different ways to approach it. But even if you have marching band included in the budget of your music boosters, you can make clear, what percentages are going to go where. Get that all decided ahead of time so that it's fair. Obviously, it makes no sense to say, well, if we're raising $50,000 for marching band, we need to raise $50,000 for choir. Choir doesn't have those kinds of needs. But there is a number that's reasonable for choir that will meet their needs. So let's have that open discussion and let's meet those needs. We found that we're able to do that. Now, we don't have a competitive marching band at St. Charles, so those particular issues are not apparent for us now. But when I taught in Naperville, we did compete, and that's how we treated it. That we weren't looking for the music boosters to raise additional funds for marching band out of proportion with choir and orchestra. We want to make sure their needs are met, and if we could do some things extra above and beyond that for the marching band program, then great.
So you mentioned that a music booster group can undermine itself very quickly. And, I think anyone who's been a band director or a teacher for long enough has had a few interactions with parents. And I'm being understated here intentionally. So do you find that you and your colleagues are sort of setting the tone for your boosters? From everything from budget to the way the whole organization's run. Do you guys talk about that and make sure that you're on the same page so that the parents are on the same page?
Yeah, the bylaws of the boosters are critical. And when I hear about teachers who are having a struggle with booster groups, it almost always comes back to bylaws that are not formulated properly. And the role of the teachers and administrators in the building are not delineated properly. So, and that was the case for us initially. We basically had no bylaws when I got to St. Charles. And so we have the same parents, leading the organization year after year. And so we instituted bylaws with elections and, a rotate. So it was a 1-year term for the president, but during that 1 year, the vice president would be in an acting presidential role. So that person would move into being the president of the group. And we just made things much clearer in terms of how it would operate, how teachers would be, what say they would have in matters, which, by the way, I feel largely we shouldn't have a say in how the funds that they raise are spent. The way we approach it is we make requests based on what we need. If we need a new mixing console for the jazz area, we provide a rationale. We ask for those funds. Or if it's a guest artist, clinician, that we talk about the yearly budgets that maybe total dollar amounts that would be available per area or per item, but we don't tell them how to spend their money, and I think that's important. But again, you have to have trust, you have to have clear communication and very clear bylaws so everybody understands how things will operate.
Mm-hmm. So I guess the next question is, what are the essentials of good bylaws? What has to be in there to make it all work?
Well, you have to have a system where there's going to be essentially term limits. I think are really important, because otherwise, you're going to have parents who might really enjoy leading a group like that, but it may not be healthy for them to do that for 8 years, if they have 2 or 3 kids coming through the program. So I think that's where some organizations start to get in trouble, where the teachers just don't really want to think about it or worry about it. The organization is kind of on their own without any real guidelines about how they should operate. And next thing you know, the teacher is expressing, at a festival event to their other colleagues that, wow, my booster organization is really out of control. So the bylaws need to state, how many positions you're going to have, what those terms are, how you're going to decide who is elected to those positions, And I think when you do that, that takes care of most of the problems that you would have. Because even if you have somebody who maybe isn't, things aren't going so well, there's a defined amount of time that they're going to be in that position.
Interesting. This is something that's never really been discussed much on this show, so I'm really fascinated with the booster, the way you do it. Do you have one last question about this? Then is what if someone does have a situation where their bylaws are out of whack and they're struggling with their parents? Is there a way for them to hit the reset button and get it set up the way they want to?
I think so, because that's what we needed to do, and that's where you involve your principal, and you sit down and say to them that, this has been kind of running ad hoc, and we really want to formalize it. And if your principal's on board, that's really all you need. Maybe you and the principal draft, the guidelines as to how things are going to move forward generally, and then you can put a committee together. What we did was, once we had the elections, that was really the main piece, having elections in place. And that was decided upon with my principal. We put the elections in place. We elected the new board of the boosters group, and then we charged them with creating the bylaws, with the expectation that there would continue to be elections and set terms. And after that, in terms of how often they meet, or, how they're going to make decisions regarding money, they can work that out. But the main thing is just having that structure in place where people aren't saying, well, I'm going to run the booster group. And I think that happens in a lot of places. And the band director might say, well, that sounds good to me because I need someone to do it. And so it's informal. It's an informal process, and informal works fine. It gives you a lot of autonomy as long as you're getting along with that person. But it doesn't work fine if over time things are deteriorating and you have no way out because you've set no term limits for these positions. And what do you do now, right? So I think that's the main thing. You can turn it around. You need to go sit down with your principal, because really the principal is in charge of booster groups when you think about it. They are the ones who say, yes, I'm going to allow a booster group for this organization, this part of my building. So it's usually athletics and then band or music, but that's a principal's decision. So involve your principal and get their input, and you can get the ball rolling in a healthy way. And that gets you most of the way there.
Yeah, I mean, the principal is sort of the ultimate point person for the parents and the outside community.
Absolutely. And if you think about it, most of the conflicts that you hear that teachers will have almost always go back to, principals not being informed of what's happening, or being a part of structuring things in a way where they can be healthy from the start.
Yeah, I mentioned a little bit earlier in the interview that both my parents were teachers. And so I always was very good. I was always very well trained, that you always sort of, as my father would have inelegantly put it, you CYA by copying in the administration, and you tell whenever the smallest thing happens that could be a conflict, you reach out to the administration and tell them. And it's been pretty successful for me over my career to make sure that I've been, when I make missteps, that I at least cover my bases, so that while I did make a mistake, at least it doesn't spiral out of control.
Any conflicts I've had, which thankfully have not been that many over the years, with administration, can almost always be traced back to not bringing them into the loop soon enough.
Absolutely.
Almost always.
Absolutely. Do you have any thoughts about getting along with administrators? I know that that's another point of conflict for some teachers.
Well, the quick answer when we talk about administrators is that it's essential to get along with them. Everybody will agree to that quickly, and someone has probably said that in every college prep course that we all had. You have to get along with your custodians and your administrators. We've all heard that. But what that looks like is essential. And now we get into the soft skills that are so critical for successful band programs. And this is where, for example, when I do hear from colleagues that are having struggles, It's hard to know exactly how to advise people because you weren't there in the room for the conversation. That applies to teaching too. If I don't see how someone teaches, I don't necessarily know how to advise them what to do. Right? I can say, try this, but if I really haven't seen how they interact with people, my advice may or may not be successful. So when we talk about administrator relationships, I worry that we do have a number of teachers who really spend no time cultivating relationships with their administrators. They're very busy, right? Both the teachers and the administrators. Everyone's doing their job. They have full plate. But then when something goes wrong and you need to go to the well, and the well is dry because you haven't spent any time building that relationship, that's when you're in trouble, right? That's when how do you resolve issues? So what do I mean by the well being dry? So a couple different things. Early on in my teaching career, it was very apparent to me that if administrators did not come to see what we did, then all the explaining in the world wouldn't matter. When we started to be a more competitive marching band in Naperville, the principal had never been to a contest. So we would come back and say, this is the success that we had. He didn't really have any idea what that meant. But so we got him to go to a contest. And the whole point being, he now would have a greater idea of what went into it, what the activity was about, how special it was for kids. And all the talking in the world couldn't replace just having him be at a contest. And so that's one example of then when conflicts come up, let's say it was related to marching band, he would have some background of what the activity is about, that it's not maybe as simplistic as he had thought prior to seeing it in action, right? So that's one very important way. I sometimes hear that principals aren't at concerts or various performance events, and it's so important to get them there. And sometimes you might have to ask a parent subtly, hey, what do you think about inviting the principal? Because maybe, if you invited them, it would, they'd say yes. I've done that before. And you're not trying to put them on the spot, but you know the importance of getting them there. They need to see what these kids are doing. And then the relational piece, finding time. I've always made it a goal to have regular meetings with my principals. And sometimes that's been easier than other times because they may not be open to that. But I always tried to seek out, hey, could we just have a sit down once a month? Because there's so much going on in the music area that I want to keep you apprised of. And usually when one of the main goals for any administrator is that their phone does not ring. When their phone rings, it's usually a problem. So when you offer to keep them more informed, they're usually going to take you up on that. And sometimes, if there's nothing really going on, then it's just a little discussion about how things are going with them personally, right? How are things in the building? Because oftentimes they don't have anyone really to talk to about what they're going through. They may not want to be as forthcoming with their assistant principals because it's more, they don't want to express any signs of struggle. And so I've found that over the years that it's been a really great relationship to build between music teacher and principal, because you can really get to know each other and build that trust so that when those moments come up where you need assistance or there's some sort of conflict, be it with parent, student, that you're not operating from that empty well, that you've built over time. You've built that trust where your principal knows that you have the best interests of students at heart.
Yeah, I think it's really crucial. I like a couple of things you said in there about involving them in the activities. I'm particularly blessed at the current school I'm at because my principal, my head of school, her son started playing euphonium at the school she's the head of school at, and he graduated through high school, played euphonium all through high school. And so she knows the activity as a parent, and it really helps me. She's really terrific. She's really, really supportive. So you said a mouthful when you said that.
Remember your first term of teaching? Learning all the skills that you don't get taught in music school? Managing a transitioning culture in your classroom? Finding out that you have to teach guitar this term? During those early years, we found out that leaning on a community of music educators was important, not only for building that knowledge in ourselves, but also maintaining enough sanity to serve the students right in front of us. Amused is a podcast centered around a community of music teachers. Between the four of us, we teach choir, band, orchestra, general, jazz, and marching band at the elementary through collegiate levels. We certainly don't have all the answers, but you're welcome to listen in while we try to find them. Join us while we work through the challenges of music teaching and celebrate the joy of bringing music making into the lives of young people. In each episode, you'll hear stories, both good and bad, about that week of teaching, and we'll try and tackle an issue that one of us is struggling with. Something we're all taught is that music brings people together, but being the only teacher in your subject at a site can be really isolating. We think everyone ought to be a part of a community, and you're welcome to come join ours. Episodes come out on Wednesdays during the school year, and you can find us wherever you get your podcasts and at amusedcast.org.
Brian, if I was a ninth grader entering your program as trumpet player Mark, 14 years old, what would my progression look like? What would my time at your high school look like in your program?
That's a really good question. I'm glad you brought that up because our approach, I teach with, in the band area, John Wojciechowski and Jen Liddickson teach with me at St. Charles, and we really value music literacy. And that seems to be something that when you say that, people just kind of say, well, of course, we all value literacy. But for example, with our ninth graders, one day a week, all year long, is spent without the instrument in their hands. And when I talk to colleagues about that, they kind of look at me like I'm crazy because how can you give up rehearsal time, 20% of your rehearsal time? And to me, we're investing time that pays dividends. So I have a number of apps that I've written over the years for iPad, and we have several carts of iPads in our department. And Wednesday is the day where we get about the business of really understanding what we're looking at and becoming very fluent at what we're doing with our reading. And that's essential to me. When students really become truly literate, what key signature am I looking at? Can I spell this scale? What is that note that's 3 ledger lines below the bottom line in the staff? Then when we go to rehearse, they're much more fluent. They literally have more time to consider dynamics, intonation, rhythm, balance, all the things that, when you talk to teachers during their contest season, whatever that's called, music performance evaluations and so forth, called different things around the country. These are things that they start to say, I can't get this solved. Pulse control, right? They're rushing, they're dragging. And these are things that oftentimes stem from the fact that the kids really don't know what they're looking at quickly enough. And so we spend a day a week literally becoming more fluent at reading notes. What note is this? And we all have it might not be ninth grade in certain parts of the country. It might be younger students, but we all have had these moments where you ask a student, what note is that? And they can't instantly tell you. They might show you a slide position, they might show you the fingering, but they can't instantly tell you, oh, that's A sharp. And yet, the director counts off the piece and expects those students to perform at a tempo that is much faster than the students can literally read the notes. So for us in the ninth grade year, a huge focus on music literacy. That's what I would say would be a major difference if they came to my school in ninth grade as opposed to perhaps another where they're going to be on the instruments every day.
So what is that, I as the college music theory professor in me is really happy about this, right? But what does that look like specifically? I guess I'm trying to wrap my head around what is that Wednesday like for ninth grade me?
Right. So, this in itself could be a ridiculously long conversation because So for example, years ago, we started to have a discussion that went something like this. What does it mean for a kid to know a key signature? What does that mean? And does that mean that if I look at 3 sharps, I call that A major? Does that mean I know that it's A major and I can tell you the order of those sharps, F, C, and G? Does it mean I can also spell you the scale, ascending and descending? Does it also mean I can play the scale? And so our discussions led to the realization that it means all of those things. To understand key, I need to be able to recognize what key it is. I need to be able to construct what key it is. I need to be able to know every note in that scale. I need to be able to perform every note in that scale. Well, as you may know, a lot of schools approach it as, I understand the key of A because listen to me play the A scale in 2 octaves. And our thought is that's not sufficient. And that's why we find ourselves in trouble. For example, when we finish a concert and we take out new music and we read it for a week with the kids and we go, it's like they didn't retain anything. I'm starting all over. Right? And we hear teachers say that all the time. And I would suggest it's because of this literacy piece, that really understanding what does it mean to really be able to function inside of a key. And that's just one example. So we could take that into rhythm and have a similar discussion about what it means to be able to process and know and understand rhythm. So those are the kinds of things that we attack on a regular basis in the 9th grade, and then to lesser degree with the older groups. But I still do spend time in those activities, all dealt with through the iPad, which reports, scoring for me. So I have data, I can establish trends. I know where kids are struggling. That is the investment of time as opposed to wasting time.
How much do you do as far as harmony? Do you do any sight singing with the kids?
We don't do nearly as much singing as I think some other schools do, and of course there are, that's also a long debate, right? That we can have. We do more recognition of interval. We do mainly for like in triads when we talk about tuning, and I do talk with the students about concepts of just intonation versus equal temperament. So in those situations, I do have them sing and be able to reproduce without their instrument. We're at 3rd or 5th, but we do more ear training through the iPad app. So when they hear an interval that they can say, that's a minor third. And I should say a lot of this literacy stuff gets back to my own first year in college. Theory professor was Tim Blicken, and he was a real taskmaster at this stuff. He really felt that you had to instantly know what note you're looking at. You had to know what key. You had to know what interval is that instantly. Because he felt until we have that, then talking about theory concepts, you're not going to be able to keep up. So that's really who really helped me to understand that, because I think I was a typical college freshman. I could play pretty well, but my theory knowledge broke down pretty quickly. And so I spent a lot of time, 2nd floor of the library at NIU. He had written these programs on the Apple IIe, and I just went up there almost every night for the whole first semester because I knew I was weak in those areas, and I just went after it. And so I do credit him. And overall, just another example of all the teachers we interact with are the ones who shape us. We all stand on other people's shoulders.
Yeah, that's really interesting, Brian. This hasn't been discussed much. I know I've said that a couple of times, but you have a very interesting way of looking at your program that's different from most band directors, and I really appreciate that. It's very fresh and interesting to me.
Well, I'm glad. It's hard to get people though to believe it, right? That it will work. So when people do contact me about using one of the apps that are available, and they're all available on the App Store, they will oftentimes try it for a week or two, and then they'll be like, "Well, my kids know how to read now." And meanwhile, we're using it the entire year, every Wednesday, all year long. And our kids are getting faster, more fluent, gaining stronger understanding of what they're looking at. So I think you have to make a commitment to it. You have to understand its value. And I found that's the toughest thing, just from a colleague standpoint. When I have these discussions, that's the toughest thing to get teachers to really believe that, attacking these concepts without the instrument is something that's really has a payoff that's valuable.
Well, sure. I teach fourth grade beginners, so I completely buy into the notion of, that fluency early on and trying to make sure that they can do all the steps. I'm a big sound to sight teacher, and so we take so long to get to actually reading music, and it doesn't always pay off for every kid, but I really think that firm fundamental matters a lot.
Well, kids want to play, obviously, and so we're all worried that if we're not playing, that we're going to lose them because they came there to play. So when I taught grades 4 and 5, and that's really when I started the first iteration of the note naming program, which is called NoteNames. I wrote that it was a HyperCard stack for the Macintosh.
I remember those. Yep.
In the 90s. That's where it started for me. And what I would do is a half-hour lesson. We were about 20-second walk from the LRC. I would check 15 minutes of what they had worked out at home on their books over the last week. So we'd play, and then we'd go to the LRC, and we would improve literacy. Because one reinforces the other. Then they would go home and work on their pages for next week. So even back then in the 90s, I was doing this. In fact, in my first teaching job at Fenwick and Nazareth, I took note cards. And I remember I made over a dozen sets of note cards so they could all pair up with a partner. And every note card just had a note on it. And on the back of the note card, the kid holding it up, it said what the name was. And I told the kids, you and your partner, you've got to get through this whole stack in X number of seconds, or you're not fluent enough yet. Well, of course, when we started this, kid's holding up the first card and the other kid can't read it. And he would get through one card in 30 seconds because he didn't know what he's looking at. But over time, every kid could get through that whole stack of cards quickly. And so that's low tech right there. But you can, in any situation, you can find a way to get kids to just deal with this literacy component on its own. And then when they put the instrument in their hands, now they can think about, okay, now what is the fingering for that note? They actually have time to think about that, or as I said before, dynamics, intonation, balance, all of these things that we want to get to, but kids can't get to that stuff if they're still looking at the note and saying, I don't know what note that is.
Yeah, I like the idea of doing this. I have, there's always a couple students who lag behind the reading in my band. So I like the idea. You mentioned that, kids want to play, but I also find that if kids get to the instrument too quickly and they don't play well, that can be just as damaging as not playing.
Right. They may not know it because they like making sound. But yeah, absolutely.
I mean, to me, again, as a teacher, like the theory teacher with a 2-year sequence, in the first couple years or the first year of beginning band, you have to be able to trust that you'll get them, that the payoff is worth the grind in the beginning.
Right.
Because if they have a successful concert at the end of the year, if their parents are excited, if they're excited, then they're going to be excited to keep going. But if they fail, they're less likely to keep going.
Right.
So yeah, that's our job as teachers, is to see the long view. That's why we exist.
Right. And to that point, if a kid in rehearsal is lost every single day, they're not feeling really good about that. Right. So the teacher's saying, why are you looking at me? Look at your music. And the kid is staring at their music because they don't want to get in trouble anymore. But they're not reading anything. They're literally staring at the middle of the page, lost. It's not a good feeling. And then it comes up time for those rental agreement renewals, and the kid's like, I don't enjoy this. So we have to arm the kids with knowledge, right? So what's the basic knowledge for a beginner? What's the name of the note I'm looking at? What's its fingering? Right? So that's what you need to build fluency. When I taught beginners, we took out highlighter and we went to the back page where the fingering chart was. And I said, for next week, here are the fingerings that you're going to have memorized. So we treated that component on its own, regardless from even playing the note. You're just going to show me that you've memorized these fingerings. Arm them with that. Arm them with the note reading. Put those things together. Now you have a fighting chance to deal with embouchure, breath support, right? But we have to, I think all too often we just throw all these things together at once. We say 1, 2, ready, go. And the kids, they just are overwhelmed.
Yeah, no, you have to break things apart. You have to break things in their component parts. I was just thinking about one of my best music teachers I ever had in my life was a piano teacher. He was an old German man who grew, was a kid during World War II, and he ended up being friends with Karl Orff as a young man before he emigrated to the United States. Mm-hmm. And this piano teacher was a master at breaking things down into its component parts. So, for example, if he's teaching, say, a Bach invention, let's say the first invention in C major, he would take the pattern out of context and make you practice the patterns out of context. And then he would slowly put them all back together. And then when you actually see the music, you already have the patterns built into your fingers to put it together. He was brilliant at that idea of just breaking everything down into component parts.
Yeah, it's so essential. And you talk to most teachers that they'll say, well, I do that. So, meaning they spent, 30 seconds. Here's one that I hear a lot. They say, well, I have the kids in their group lesson. Let's say it's 12 clarinets. I have the kids all name the notes in the phrase together. And that counts as breaking things down. And then I say to that teacher, I'll tell you what, just start talking and say anything you want. And they start to talk and I start to say what they're saying, because we can all do that with just a few milliseconds delay, right? Especially if you're watching the person. You can, so if you start to talk to me right now, I could just imitate what you're saying back to you, right? So a group of kids naming notes, there's going to be kids in that group who are doing exactly that. They're not reading the notes. They're listening to what the kid next to them says, and kind of corporately, they come up with the right answer altogether. That's not fluency, and that's not breaking things apart. That's just kind of a, almost a pull a rabbit out of the hat type thing, right? Oh yes, they all name the notes. We're good to go. So you have to really individualize this sort of thing to really find out who's fluent, who isn't, and then start to target how you're going to get them to where every kid is fluent.
So, Brian, this has been a really fascinating conversation so far, but there's something that you've done that many of my listeners know, and that's that you're the founder of the Facebook Band Directors Group.
Yes, guilty as charged. We, years ago, this is really showing my age now, but, before we had Facebook, and there was such a time, it doesn't feel like it, but even back then, it was difficult for teachers to really have meaningful discussions. There were what were called bulletin boards back then, and there were, I think NAFME ran one, and a few other organizations. They're not very conversant. You would post a question, and then someone else post a response, and maybe one thing was you never got notification really. So even when Facebook started their group, there were no notifications. It was very rudimentary. But over the years, it's really blossomed, and we're up to, I guess, over 27,000 members now. And Facebook has provided the tools where we can really be productive, have good discussions. That means you can also have not so good discussions, right? That's going to happen. But I'm proud of where the group has been able to go. When we started this, my concern was that there were associations you could be involved with, and I don't need to name them. Anyone who's been teaching for a while knows kind of the band director associations that you could be a member of. But by design, virtually all of those are select. They're very select. There's an application process. You may have to have references. You may have to have a proven track record of performances with your bands. But the Facebook group, everybody is welcome. If you're a teacher, you can be there. And so I feel that's important because we have a lot. I mean, the vast majority of teachers are teaching in very small schools, under-resourced, and who do they turn to? They're not allowed to be a member of some of these organizations unless they've achieved X, Y, and Z. Where do they go? Who do they turn to? So that was really why I felt it was important to start the group, so that everybody could have a place to go to say, I need help with this. And the whole idea is to try to close that gap, especially for younger teachers, between experience and, what you know today coming out of college and where you can only get through experience. Can we close that gap a little sooner, because other people who've gone through these things can share those insights with you and accelerate your experience? So it's been fantastic, and as anyone knows who's spent time on the group, it can provide some frustrating moments as well. But overall, I really think I know it's been helpful for me personally. I think many people would say that they've gotten one or two great ideas, and that right there, if you can say that, then it's been worth it.
No doubt about that. It's an interesting animal, as it exists. You see all kinds of things, and we see some controversies bloom and then fade, and then bloom and then fade. And, there's the occasional bad behavior, but it's a really interesting group. And, I love this idea of trying to shorten that distance between, being a beginner teacher and an experienced teacher. And so what have you seen as far as through that group over the years? Has that helped? Are you seeing trends in that?
I think so. I would like to think so. One thing that I have noticed over the years is that I do have a little bit of a concern about the overall level of preparation coming out of college. And I think there are several reasons for that concern. One is we know we are seeing declining enrollment in college overall, and certainly for teachers. The one of the latest articles I read was that last fall there were over 300,000 unfilled teacher positions across the country. So we know we've entered this era of teacher shortage, which means we have fewer majors in college. So I think that has made things challenging for our colleges and universities across the country. And I think what's a result of that is that I think we have more students being admitted to major that maybe would not have been admitted. And I say this very carefully because I don't want to offend any of my teaching colleagues. We all are in this to continue to improve. We know that the way we come out of college is not how, we're not a finished product. But when you consider that maybe the bar has been lowered to get into the profession strictly because of need, because these, especially smaller colleges and universities, have to stay afloat, and they need tuition dollars and they need enrollment. I worry that we do have some folks who are coming out with some serious shortcomings when they start teaching, maybe more so than a decade or certainly 20 years ago. So it's another reason I think the group is so important, that we can help to address those shortcomings. But it's really incumbent upon young teachers today to continue to improve their musicianship and improve their pedagogy. It's so essential that you carve out time. And it's a busy profession, but you have to carve out the time to address your shortcomings. So if you left college without any jazz experience, and now you've taken a job where there's a jazz band, it's incumbent upon you to seek help to really build those jazz skills. We can't just stand in front of students when we don't really know what we're doing and think that the music is going to teach them, right? Music does not teach the kids, or marching band. So if you double reed players oftentimes maybe they're didn't have marching band experience, and they go all through college and then they're out and they get a job and they have a marching band. Well, you have to address that, right? So I remember coming out of college and not knowing jazz harmony well enough. I played lead trumpet. I wasn't a soloist, so I wasn't really analyzing chord changes like I needed to. And I remember ordering Frank Mantooth's Jazz Voicings piano book and really digging in on my own time to figure this out, because I knew I had a responsibility to students. So that's never going to change. We always have to continue to improve, but I worry that the gap is widening between, when the senior graduates now, where they are in terms of their content and their pedagogy and where they need to be. I'm worried that gap is a little wider these days. And that's why we see maybe teachers exiting the profession more than we would like, right? Because they're not quite ready. So that's a concern. I'm hoping we can continue to address that through the Facebook group to help teachers with that knowledge. But again, the Facebook group can't teach teachers to teach, right? We can provide some advice, some resources, but really helping teachers to become better teachers, that's an area that I think we may have to look at, almost a remedial sort of situation post-undergrad.
Yeah, it's interesting. We live in a crowdsourced world now. I think about your Facebook group, and I think about the middle school Facebook group and the beginner band Facebook group. I do a podcast based on the same idea. I started this podcast because I remember being a first-year teacher in California in my 20s and having no one to talk to except for, just a couple people around me who were band directors, and how alone I felt back then.
Right.
And we have this muted podcast network, and then there's the after sectionals that Darcy and Jenna do, and John Dennis has a pedagogy podcast, and we're kind of trying to fill in these gaps, but ultimately I think there's just so much to know, and the world's getting bigger and bigger every day.
Well, that's the problem. So in students' defense, the knowledge base has grown exponentially. So even for just the kids who are not going to go into music in college, just their school band experience, the time, their time is so divided because they have to know so much more. And the technology curve and what has happened. When we were kids, technology was, a strobe tuner, for gosh sakes. And, so that has changed so drastically. And a lot of pressures. But ultimately, I think that's led to what my concern is, that we've learned to do many things not so well, right? So we're able to spin a lot of plates, but that's not the same as doing things well. And so when we get our jobs, and now our main allegiance is to making each kid better, it can be an overwhelming thought process that, oh my gosh, I don't really know clarinet well enough. I don't really understand marching band. I don't really know how to set up my jazz player with a pickup and where to place the amp, and on and on, right? So this kind of remedial piece is something I've been thinking about, like how do we do that? Because it's not necessarily a master's degree. A master's degree is where you go to apply your successful 3 to 5 years of teaching and take it to the next level. But what I'm talking about is kind of filling in the gaps from undergrad, right? So I don't know. I don't have an answer for that. It's just something that's been on my mind.
Yeah, well, certainly. It's become more complicated to be a band director now than it was, I think.
For sure.
Hello, my name is Bryce Adams. I teach band at North Kitsap High School in Paulsbo, Washington. I'm commissioning Garrett Hope to compose a 4-movement suite for grade 3 band. Garrett Hope's music is exciting, it's accessible, the kids love it, it's fun to play. This piece will be inspired by the 4 winds from Greek mythology, each one having different character and style. The music will be delivered on November 1st, 2020. The first movement, Boreas, is already written, published, and available. I invite you to join a consortium with me to help bring this music to life. The best benefit to joining this consortium is the amazing deal. The buy-in for this project is only $250. You will receive the music for all 4 movements, totaling about 16 minutes worth of music. I would invite everyone to join the consortium. Supporting new music by living composers is what keeps our art alive. Garrett and I will both be at Midwest this year if you'd like to talk about this opportunity. You can find us at the TPC Collective booth. To join this consortium, go to garretthope.com/wins. That's wins with an S.
All right, Brian. So this has been a really great conversation. We should probably wrap this up with the final questions if you're ready.
Sure.
So these are questions that I ask of all my guests, and they kind of create a common collection of answers about these philosophical issues in music education. And so the first one I'll ask is not to be controversial, but it can be, and it's, where do you draw the line between healthy and unhealthy competition in music?
The way I've always approached that, and this is just for me, I always felt that invited performances in concert and jazz were about as far as I wanted to go down the competition road. So over my career, my bands have been to Super State and Bands of America Festival, Midwest. Those are, I felt, were, because they were invited performances, not competitions, those were things I wanted my students to be involved with. I think it's very difficult for students to detach a competitive situation from the music. Marching band, I think, can be a healthy competitive activity. And there are many examples of that. The one that always comes to my mind is Greg Bim at Marian Catholic, who has decades of, I think, healthy competitive approach to the activity. So I believe in it there. For myself in jazz and concert, I never found a way to really make it work from a competitive standpoint.
Yeah, I think it's the personality of the director really matters a lot. Some people can do it really effortlessly. Some people can't.
So here's the thing. We all understand this, that the band is a reflection of the director.
Sure.
Everybody understands that, at least from a basic level. So if kids are not handling the competitive aspects of it, it's either because we as teachers have not found a way to explain to them how to deal with it in a healthy way, or they should not be in that situation. Mm-hmm. It's really one or the other, right? So those of us that have kind of broached this subject, the worst thing you can do is leave kids in that situation where you haven't found a way to make it healthy. That's, I guess, my main concern about it. So I recognized in myself that I did not really see a clear way to make concert band where I wanted kids to really focus on the music. I had not found a way to have them also deal with the competitive side of that would preserve the musical love.
Right.
So that all comes back to us. Ultimately, my friend Kathy, who you know, Leibinger, says it may not be your fault, but it is your problem, right? So if the situation is unhealthy, it's incumbent upon us to make the necessary changes at the end of the day. So, yeah, that's why, again, I go back to Ken Snook, Greg Bim, these guys who for so many years found a healthy way where their kids would be applauding for other students in other bands. They would never be jumping up and down or rubbing it in anyone's face when they were successful. You know, they had such a healthy outlook on that. It was almost that I think their kids always understood that marching band is like a game of golf where it's you against the course, right? Those kids always understood that it was about their own improvement, their own presentation, never about the other groups. I think that's how they approached it. And I think that's the way to do it.
All right, Brian, this is a question that's difficult for many music educators, but I think over doing this podcast, I've come to realize that it's just individual. And that's, how do you find work-life balance in a career as a music teacher? How did you find your balance?
Well, that's a great question. My wife is director of choirs at North Central College. And so for us, I think that we always, because we're both involved in this performance career, we understand how busy it is. And I think it might be harder for folks not in that situation. It kind of gets back to my administrator talk, you know, having a spouse who is aware, you know, can come to certainly not all events, and I think that's important, but enough of the events to kind of see what's involved, to have to be able to empathize with the situation is helpful. But I will say, balance-wise, that for many years, my wife and I would have we called it the marriage preservation vacation. And we made sure that we always carved out time for just us at least once a summer, where we would go on vacation. And when our daughter was young, would stay with grandparents. We just really felt that recharge time was critical. Because to be honest with you, I don't think balance is something that, I think it's always in imbalance when you are particularly a high school band director. It's going to be, it will not be balanced. So you have to, when you can, then take those opportunities to recharge, yourself and also your relationship at home.
All right, Brian, this is a big question, and I know you've touched on some things that you're concerned about, but it's sort of kind of a broad way of looking at it. And what are the challenges facing music education or band, and how can we best meet them?
Yeah, it's difficult. We're seeing, I mentioned the teacher shortage we're seeing now nationwide. I'm concerned about so many. The good news is this: if you're coming out of college now, you're going to work. You're going to find work. That's the good news. I'm worried what's going to be happening in the next 10 to 20 years, because teacher pay is going to have to go up. And that's good. But as all these factors start to work together, unfilled teacher positions, teachers who are uncertified being hired because they have to fill positions, I'm worried about the struggle that's going to be taking place as this gets worked out. As teacher pay will then go on the rise, I think we'll start to see more high school students choose to major in education, but that's going to take time. So in the meantime, I'm a little bit worried about the push and pull that's going to be happening. I think that the states that can pay more are going to be getting a higher percentage of the certified teachers, which means conversely, a lot of states are going to have a lot of uncertified teachers. And I'm worried about what's going to happen there. And then, of course, as dollars become tighter and tighter, we know that the arts will take the hit. So I think, I don't mean to be so doomsday, but what I foresee happening is as these states start to, the haves and the have-nots financially, that we're going to see some arts programs maybe take a hit because they've got to raise the salaries to attract the certified teachers.
Brian, if I could give you a time machine and set it to the afternoon of your high school graduation, what advice would you give yourself?
The one thing that seems to consistently come to mind over these years as I've been finishing up the last part of my career here is that I wish I had practiced more piano. And so that may be a very basic answer where some folks may think more broadly about that question. But to me, as I was leaving high school and getting ready to enter college, I wish someone had said to me, "You don't understand how important piano is to a music educator." The ability to look at a score and be able to play that on the piano is so valuable. You conceptualize music differently, I believe, and I've tried to get better. But if I had to roll back the clock and really just sit myself down, I would say, yeah, you think you're a good trumpet player, but you really need to have a more global understanding of music. And for example, look at our best conductors in the world. They're almost always pianists. That should tell us something.
If you had a choice, what would be the final work for wind ensemble or band that you'd want to conduct or perform in or hear, and why?
So the way I'd answer that is, I hope the way I answer that question every time I have to choose a piece, and that is I would want to conduct the piece that fits every individual kid in my ensemble perfectly at that point in time. That's one of the biggest problems that we have as educators, and this gets back to things like discipline problems, the vibe of the group. an upward trajectory of a group, an upward spiral, right? Momentum. When we talk about all those things, they're always related to repertoire choices. So I will typically say that my repertoire decisions are responsible for the most fulfilling things that have happened in my career, but they're also responsible for the things that haven't gone well. My worst moments can almost always be traced back to repertoire choice. So we all understand that this saying, right note at the wrong time is a wrong note. Everybody has said that at some point to a kid. What we don't say to ourselves enough is the right piece at the wrong time is the wrong piece. So people will say, why didn't this go well? It's a great piece. Yes, but you chose it at the wrong time. Why are my rehearsals so unfocused? Why are these kids so talkative? Why aren't they preparing every day? Why aren't they doing what I asked them to do? And oftentimes it's because you chose the right piece at the wrong time. And it's a very sophisticated thing to get it right. We don't always get it right, but when I think about what would I conduct for my final piece, and by the way, I'm thinking about that because I'm going to retire at the end of 2021, so it's coming. I just want to make sure that it's the perfect piece for those students at that moment where every kid feels challenged, they feel inspired, they feel engaged, they feel like their contribution makes a difference. Whatever that piece is, I can't tell you because we're not there yet. And that's next year's trajectory. I have to, as we go through the year, that's why I'm not the type of person that's going to put in stone the whole year's worth of programming until I have that first couple weeks of rehearsal and I hear where those kids are. So I don't know what it'll be, but I hope I get it right.
Do you have any sense? Do you have any candidates?
Well, I know I have my parameters are strong for a very percussion has always been something that's important to me because I feel my percussionists are every bit as deserving as the brass and the woodwinds. So I'm always of that mindset. But next year I will have a particularly strong. I mean, arguably the strongest musicians in the group will be the percussionists. So I will definitely need to be sure that it's a piece that values them as equals. And that's about as far down the road as I think I can get at this point.
Is there anything coming up that you'd like to share or promote, Brian?
I don't know. I don't think so. I guess I could share my blog address with you if that would be something that would be of interest to folks. It's not something where I write regularly, but when I do have sort of thoughts that I'm just struggling with, I tend to put up a blog post, and that address is teachingmusic.posthaven.com. And you can read my thoughts there. And if anyone wants to have an exchange of ideas, they can contact me through the site.
And Brian, how can people get in touch with you?
Email is brianjwis@gmail.com. And there's also a contact button on the blog.
Excellent. Brian, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, Mark. I appreciate it.